Okay, guys, so today we're going to be looking at the early republic. So this goes along with your lecture from last week where we looked at the first 5 presidencies from Washington to Monroe. So this is looking at after the War of 1812 and as we emerge into that era of good feeling, understanding how the nation starts to change. And so this is known as the Age of Jackson as well as the role of expansion. So the first portion of this lecture is going to be about the Age of Jackson. So the presidency of Andrew Jackson and looking at the time frame of 1824 to about the 1840s. So Andrew Jackson became a well-known hero after the War of 1812. And so from that point on, he entered into a role of politics. So in 1824, Jackson ran for president against John Quincy Adams, who is the son of former President John Adams. So John Quincy Adams had been the Secretary of State for President Monroe. So he's had experience in the political arena. Well, in 1824, when it came down to the election, Jackson had a narrow victory in terms of the popular vote. So he had the majority of the popular vote. But when it came to the Electoral College, there was a tie. And when there's a tie in the Electoral College, it has to be taken to the House of Representatives to vote and decide. So when the House of Reps went to vote, one of the most prominent representative members at the time was Henry Clay. And Henry Clay did not like Andrew Jackson. He felt Andrew Jackson was loud and not of a good character when it came to being a politician or being the future president of the United States. He didn't feel that Jackson had enough experience as a politician. So Henry Clay, being a prominent member of the House of Representatives, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. And so many in the House of Representatives voted the way Henry Clay did, and it ended up being a victory for John Quincy Adams. Now, Andrew Jackson accepted this. He understood that this was the process set up in the Constitution, and so he congratulated John Quincy Adams and felt, okay, you are now the president. But then, once John Quincy Adams started selecting his cabinet members, this is where Jackson starts to get angry. So John Quincy Adams selected Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. And this is where Jackson and his supporters claimed that there was a corrupt bargain. There must have been an inside deal. Now, you may be asking, why does it matter who John Quincy Adams selected as his Secretary of State? Well, history had shown with our previous presidential administrations that whoever Secretary of State was going to be the next president. So, for example, for George Washington, his Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Now, while Thomas Jefferson was not, the next president, he did become president, and it was a debated victory for John Adams during his presidency. Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State was James Madison, who became president after him. James Madison's Secretary of State was James Monroe, who became president after him. And I just said that Monroe's Secretary of State had been John Quincy Adams, who just became president. So it felt like by naming Henry Clay as John Quincy Adams Secretary of State, that he's essentially handpicking the next president. And this is where Jackson felt that this was a level of corruption that had to be changed within the national government. And so immediately Andrew Jackson started to campaign for his next election in 1828. And so this time around, there's going to be a different playing field. Jackson, first off, is ruthless against John Quincy Adams. It's an ugly election. If we think our current election process can get ugly between candidates, it's nothing between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. They detest each other. Their supporters detest each other. But another thing that changes about the election 1828 is the fact that universal male suffrage has been passed. So in all of the previous elections, you had to own property to be able to vote. But now you only had to be a white male of a certain age to be able to vote. They lifted the property clause. And so now there's this huge number of new voters that are going to be able to vote in the 1828 election. And Jackson uses that to his advantage. So first off, Jackson runs on a campaign nickname of Old Hickory. Old Hickory was a nickname given to him during the War of 1812, where he's seen as a hero from the War of 1812 from the Battle of New Orleans. But then talking about that universal male suffrage, the common man. Andrew Jackson presents himself as a common man. He says, I'm just like all of you who are voting for the first time. I'm not of a high education. I don't come from a traditional wealthy background that all of our previous presidents had had. Now, mind you, Andrew Jackson is not poor. He has his own plantation known as a Hermitage in Tennessee. He's quite wealthy, but he came from humble beginnings. And so he tries to relate to the masses on that level. And so, easy to say, in the 1828 election, it's an overwhelming victory for Jackson. And he's going to bring in a whole new wave to the national government. And so, with Andrew Jackson as president, people either love him or hate him. There's very little middle ground when it comes to him as a president. So looking at some of the changes and things that Jackson implements during his presidency. First is the spoil system. So it comes from the old phrase, to the victors go the spoils. So he says, if you're elected president, you should be able to have those who support you and your ideas in the federal offices and administrative positions. So he claims incoming presidents could remove others from administrative positions, particularly if those people who fill those positions were of the previous administrations, and place those who are loyal to him in office. Now remember, he had just accused John Quincy Adams of a corrupt bargain by hand selecting, Henry Clay. But here Jackson thinks that, hey, I should have people who are loyal to me. I should be able to award them administrative positions for supporting me in becoming president. Jackson also believes in the rotation in office. He doesn't believe that you should hold a federal position for life. He feels that, anybody can hold these federal positions. And so he thinks that, it should be on a 2 to 3 year rotation where you hold a job in the federal government and then you rotate out so that it opens up an opportunity for more of the common man to be able to have a position within the federal government. Sometimes this worked in favor of Jackson, sometimes it backfired on him because he didn't necessarily put the most qualified individuals into those important government positions. And then it came to Jackson's cabinet. So once again, he uses his theory of the spoil system and he appoints a bunch of his supporters and buddies and friends to be his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Treasury. And many in Congress and the government started to nickname them his kitchen cabinet, that they came in through the kitchen door or the back door. They weren't necessarily the most qualified individuals for their position. Another issue that was part of Jackson's administration was that of expansion. So again, we're talking about expanding lands. We talked about, in class, the market revolution and how the cotton industry is booming. So there's a high demand for lush land in the southeastern part of the United States. But at the time, a lot of that land was still occupied by many Native American tribes, and they are known as the 5 civilized tribes. They were the Seminoles, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Cherokee, and the, the fifth one is leaving me. But anyways, the 5 civilized tribes are considered civilized because they'd adopted many European customs. Many of them had learned to speak English. They dressed in European style. So they were, quote, civilized by American standards. But that didn't matter. As the demand for cotton was growing, the demand for land was as well. And so many citizens were putting pressure on the administration to try to force the Native Americans from their land. Now, Jackson is not the first president to try to address this. I mean, Thomas Jefferson wanted the Native Americans to move. So did James Monroe and Madison. There are many, but none of them actually forced the issue. Andrew Jackson is going to be the first president to actually force the issue when he issues the Indian Removal Act. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830 is going to force many of those Native Americans to abandon their homelands to move into what was known as Indian Territory, which is present-day state of Oklahoma. Now, the Choctaws and the Chickasaws reluctantly agreed to the terms. They were given land, they were given some financial compensation, and they moved to the Indian Territory. those who stayed were attacked severely by local Americans who, again, wanted control of the land. But one tribe in particular, the Cherokee, went and used the political system. They wanted to hold on to their ancestral land. And so they brought their case to the Supreme Court. Now, there was an American citizen who represented them by the name of Worcester. And he, because the Cherokee had no standing in the court themselves, but he pleaded their case on their behalf in Worcester versus Georgia. So Georgia, the state of Georgia, was trying to, put a limit on who could go into Indian territory. And they had to, sign an oath that they would swear loyalty to the American government. And Worcester refused to do it. And so, he was arrested. He was not allowed to go in Cherokee land. And this is how the case got taken to the Supreme Court. Well, at the time, Chief Justice John Marshall, same from Marshall Court, argued that, the Cherokee had a treaty with the national government. And so state of Georgia could not override that treaty. And essentially, Chief Justice John Marshall said the Cherokee have the rights to their land. Okay, so they could challenge the Indian Removal Act. He sides with the Cherokee, saying this is their land. They have to uphold the treaty. And Jackson says, Marshall has given his verdict, but now I want to see him enforce it. So Jackson directly challenges a Supreme Court decision and ends up completely ignoring it and forcing the Cherokee out regardless of the verdict in Worcester versus Georgia. And this forced removal of the Cherokee became known as the Trail of Tears. They're forced to leave their lands. They have to march over about a couple thousand miles to be able to get to Oklahoma. The travel took about 3 months. And over 3,000 Native Americans are going to lose their lives on the trail alone. We're not even talking about the holding areas, essentially a concentration camp where the Cherokee were held when it was time for them to be able to move. Disease spread rampantly throughout those concentration camps. There was starvation, there was lack of supplies. So it was a black stain on American history at this time, the treatment of these individuals so that they were able to gain land. Another thing that Jackson dealt with during his presidency, which we've talked about in class, is, of course, the Nullification Crisis. So as part of the American system, tariffs were an essential component. But in the South, many felt that tariffs only favored Northern industries. And many people felt, particularly in South Carolina, that President Jackson would side with them, being from the South and being a plantation owner himself, that he would support them in abolishing the increased tariff of 1824. So the tariff of abominations is brought up in 1828. And the state of South Carolina is the one who's kind of leading the cause against the tariff that they've nicknamed the tariff of abominations. Well, Jackson's vice president was John C. Calhoun, and John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina. And so John C. Calhoun actually gives up his position as vice president because he and Jackson do not see eye to eye when it comes to the tariff of abominations. And he becomes a senator to be able to challenge the idea of the tariff. So this is where the state of South Carolina threatens with the nullification theory, where they claim that a state can consider a law made by Congress void or unconstitutional and that they do not have to follow it. So South Carolina used this theory against the tariff of abominations. They also take it a step further by threatening to secede or to leave the Union if the tariff is not repealed. Well, Jackson does not take this lightly. He says, look, this is a law that has been made by Congress. We are going to enforce this law. So he passes through the Force Act, where Jackson threatens to use military force in South Carolina to ensure that the tariff is collected. Now, this makes, many people consider Jackson a tyrant. They criticize him. How dare he use the military against American citizens? But remember, in our previous lecture, George Washington did the exact same thing when it came to the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington led the military against that Whiskey Rebellion. But Jackson, again, he's such a strong presence that many people question, his role and his use of the executive branch. Well, with the force bill, South Carolina ends up backing down in terms of the tariff. Congress actually goes through and lowers the tariff. And so this is where the state of South Carolina revokes their theory of nullification when it comes to the tariff. Now they go further and nullify the force bill. They consider that to be unconstitutional based on principle. But this is where the ideas of nullification and secession are born, and it's not going to go away. The last major component of Jackson's administration is the role of the Bank of the United States, or the BUS. Again, this was created as part of the American system. We needed a national entity to be able to manage the wealth and taxes that were coming in terms of trade, along with our industrialization and industrial growth in the North. Jackson considered the Bank of the United States to be unconstitutional because there's nothing in the Constitution that says that you can have a Bank of the United States. Jackson also hated the Bank of the United States because he felt it protected the wealthy and it protected wealthy industrial owners of the North. So the bank's charter was coming up, okay, so a recharter, which means it had to be renewed. And Jackson ended up vetoing the Bank of the United States. And this created quite a shock within Congress because the presidency, while that is a power of the presidency, former administrations had never used the veto power. It had been used 9 times in 42 years. So it was quite a shock to Congress that Jackson would veto the recharter of a well-established, national entity like the Bank of the United States. So even though he's vetoed its recharter, he still takes it a step further to try to cripple the bank before, the charter runs out. He sets up his pet banks or state banks. He withdraws funds from the Bank of the United States and places them in select state banks, which is going to create some economic instability, which will eventually lead to a recession in 1836. But this will take place after Jackson is out of office. So what this results in is the birth of a new political party led by Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the largest opponents of Jackson and large supporters of the American system and nationalism and the Bank of the United States. They went up against the Jacksonian Democrats. And so here we are once again with another two-party system within our government. Okay, the next component is starting to take a look at the role of expansion and the idea and concept of manifest destiny. So this is going to take place kind of after the age of Jackson, and as other presidencies start to emerge, there's going to be a push to settle out west. So we're looking at the 1840s to the 1850s. So what is manifest destiny? Destiny is meant to be obvious, it is inevitable. And many felt a religious connection, that it was our God-given right to expand from one ocean to the next. That had always been a goal of the United States, is to be able to have control pretty much of the spans of North America. And we wanted to expand north, we wanted to expand south, and we particularly wanted to expand west. We see this first with Thomas Jefferson. In 1803, he had the Louisiana Purchase, which at the time was controversial. But he made this land purchase from Napoleon, and it got another European presence out of North America. So again, think about the Monroe Doctrine, wanting to keep European influence out of North America. The role of expansion would help to do that. So France is now out of North America after the Louisiana Purchase. So we got, the land west of the Mississippi all the way to parts of Montana and Wyoming and parts of, getting all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Then in 1819, under Monroe's administration, we take over Spanish Florida. So in the Adams-Onis Treaty, Spain, who's lost most of their colonies and are dealing with the turmoil of the Latin American revolutions in South America, decides to give up their claims to Spanish Florida. And so we get Spanish Florida as well as control of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. So now we've kind of finished out our East Coast claims. We need to continue to move west. What's the desire? Why do citizens want to move out west? One is to claim land, to be able to claim land so that Europe can't. There's more living space. Our population is growing, as well as the number of immigrants who are moving to the United States from Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Norway and Sweden, as well as, those of the traditional north and western parts of, Germany and Great Britain. Many of those settlers are coming in, and the East Coast is crowded. They want living space. They want the ability to own land, and land is going to be cheap out in the West. With the market revolution and the expansion of the cotton industry and the textile industry, we're also seeking new markets and more resources so that we can continue to grow as an industrial nation. And then there's always those time-honored ideas of spreading the word of Christianity, the word of God, and also spreading the ideals of democracy. So what we start to see emerge are trails out west, these common trails that citizens are going to take. There's going to be many dangers and challenges along these trails, but many American citizens, see this as their rugged individualism. These are elements of American identity, the ability to survive on your own, where you don't have to answer to anybody. You can make a life for you and your family. So we see three major trails emerge. One is the Santa Fe Trail, and that one is for trade. It starts in Independence, Missouri, and it kind of goes through the Southwest, follows the Missouri River for a while, and then takes a fork into Mexican territory. So Santa Fe is the capital of New Mexico today, but at the time that was Mexican territory. And so it was meant for trade with Mexico. The Oregon Trail is what was used primarily by the settlers. So they're going to travel again from Independence, Missouri, and travel across the Missouri River and head more north to the Oregon Territory, through the Great Plains, through the Rocky Mountains to get to that Pacific coast. And then there's also the Mormon trails. So as the growing number of Mormons start to emerge, many of them are experiencing persecution by other Protestant groups on the eastern coast of the United States. And so they take it upon themselves to leave the boundaries of the United States and settle in territories. And we'll see them settle in Salt Lake City, Utah. So as we're trying to expand, sometimes our expansion is going to happen in a peaceful means, and there are going to be times of conflict. One of our peaceful annexations or acquisitions was that of the Oregon Territory, which will take place in 1846. Now, it doesn't start out as necessarily a peaceful campaign. James K. Polk was running for president, and one of his things, he was an expansionist, and he came up with the campaign slogan, 5440 or fight. 5440 was the line of latitude that he claimed for the Oregon Territory. Now, Great Britain and the United States both claimed this territory in Oregon. And James K. Polk was said, look, I'm going to get this territory for the United States, and I'm willing to fight for it. Lucky for him, Great Britain wasn't willing to fight. Great Britain's fur trade had gone down substantially, and the land just wasn't that lucrative when it came to farming or agriculture. So Great Britain's like, look, we're not going to fight you for it. We'll peaceably agree to align at the 49th parallel. So in 1846, we acquire Oregon Territory, which is present-day states of Washington, a little bit of Montana, Idaho, and Oregon. Prior to this, then came Texas. And so here, when we're talking about the role of Texas, so as I mentioned before with the Santa Fe Trail, that was Mexican territory. Mexico had won their independence from Spain. But what Mexico realized is they had a vast territory that they had to cover. So to try to occupy the land and to make money of the land, they encouraged American citizens to move into Mexican territory, which is present-day Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlers like the idea because particularly in Texas and portions, there is lush land. And again, our cotton industry is looking to grow. So many settlers, pack up their belongings and they head west into this Texas territory in search of this lush land. Well, eventually, Texas is going to be overrun by American citizens. And one of the terms that they had to agree to by going into Mexican territory was that they would abide by Mexican law. So they would convert to Catholicism, which they didn't. They would learn to speak Spanish, which they didn't. And they also would not bring slaves because Mexico had banned the institution of slavery. The Texans also ignored that. So Mexico is growing frustrated with the number of American citizens taking over land in Texas, and they actually closed their borders. They refused to allow other American citizens to come into a Mexican territory. However, this is going to prove to be difficult to be able to defend. So the United States, to try to make things peaceful, offers to buy the territory of Texas. John Quincy Adams offered $1 million. Mexico refused. Andrew Jackson then said, look, I'll pay you $5 million. Again, Mexico refuses. And so the Texans realized that the only way that they're going to be able to truly govern themselves is to declare independence. And so they fight Mexico for their independence. And this is where the phrase, remember the Alamo. The Alamo was actually a Mexican victory. They defeat the Texans, but it becomes a rally cry to remember the Alamo. And Texans rally up again. We have key leaders like Steve Austin, hence the name for Austin, Texas, and also Sam Houston, Texas. Eventually, Texas will win their independence from Mexico, and they become their own country. Texas was its own country, the Republic of Texas, the Lone Star Republic in 1836. Sam Houston is their first president. But Texas never intended to be its own country for long, because again, the vast majority of Texans were former American citizens. So Sam Houston goes to the United States and says, look, we'd like to become part of the United States. We'd prefer for you to annex us. But this created a great congressional debate, within Congress about whether or not we should annex Texas. Because one, it could provoke a war with Mexico. Mexico was still disputing boundary lines with Texas. And so annexing Texas could just make that relationship with Mexico worse. Also was the issue of slavery. Congress is trying to limit the spread of the institution of slavery by expanding into Texas and taking Texas as a state. It would create an imbalance between the free states and the slave states, which we'll talk about in some of the upcoming slides. But regardless of this debate, Texas will eventually be annexed in 1845, and it does become the 28th state of the United States. And that's why even today it's known as the Lone Star State, as heritage to the Republic. And fun fact, part of their annexation process is Texas can leave the Union anytime they want to and become their own country again. They wouldn't do that, but once in a while there's always a Texas senator or representative who likes to remind them, we can just leave the Union. Well, as Congress had predicted, by annexing Texas, this is going to further break the relationship between Mexico and the United States. And we do eventually end up going to war with Mexico because they're angry about the annexation of Texas and along the borderline. So the Rio Grande is the river that is the disputed boundary line between Mexico and Texas. And so our president sent Zachary Taylor down to the Rio Grande along with American troops and just sitting there watching the Mexican army on the other side. Tensions are brewing and eventually shots are fired and we go to war with Mexico. Again, this is a congressional debate, again with the issue of slavery, because if we take over more land, are we going to allow the institution of slavery to continue to spread? Well, we end up winning the war with Mexico, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is established. The United States ends up paying Mexico $15 million. Now you may wonder, US won, why are they paying Mexico? But this was money to try to ease things over with Mexico. And so we gathered the territories of California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. The last bit of our expansion that's going to complete the continental US is a tiny little slither of land in southwestern part of the United States, part of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, known as the Gadsden Purchase. And so the Gadsden Purchase cost the United States $10 million. We paid $10 million once again to Mexico to get this little slither of land. But it is going to be what finishes our southwestern border and what makes what is our current continental U.S. So as I talked about the role of manifest destiny expansion, the issue of slavery kept cropping up as a concern with expanding west. And so now we're going to take a look at what did our government do to try to address these growing concerns about the institution of slavery in regards to the role of expansion. So Congress always wanted to try to maintain a balance of free states versus slave states. In 1808, the United States had banned the importation and exportation of slaves, so the international slave trade. But that did not ban the movement of slaves within the United States. We just were not going to bring slaves from West Africa anymore on the Middle Passage. As the United States continues to expand west, the issue of slavery becomes a larger source of tension, because are we going to allow this institution, which, mind you, the founding fathers thought would have died out by now, are we going to allow this institution continue to spread into the new territory? Well, our first challenge comes up in 1818. So after the Louisiana Purchase and the exploration by Lewis and Clark, many people start to settle in the land of the Louisiana Purchase. And as you got a certain number of people from the Land Ordinance Act and the Northwestern Ordinance Act, you were able to apply for statehood. Well, at the time in 1818, Congress was balanced. We had 10 free states and we had 10 slave states. So everything seemed even. Well, Missouri applies for statehood in 1818, and it wanted to be a slave state. Okay. The concern in Congress is if they admit Missouri into the Union, it would tip the balance. There'd be more slave states than free states, and they were concerned about the advantage that slave states might have over the free states. So Henry Clay, the same Henry Clay with John Quincy Adams and the H. of Jackson, comes up with a compromise, okay, known as the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He says, we will have states enter the Union in pairs, okay? So it just so happens that Maine also applied for statehood. Maine would enter as a free state, and Missouri would enter as a slave state. So we now have 11 of each, and it maintains the balance. For future reference, Henry Clay devised a line. He says the 36-30 line, so 36 degrees, 30 minutes latitude, okay, which is a line, if you look at the map there, right below Missouri, which is red. There's like a little purple line across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. That is the 36-30 line, which is going to divide the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory. So keep in mind that we do not have control of Texas at this time. That is still Mexican territory. He says anything north of this line, slavery would be banned, okay, with, of course, the exception of Missouri. So that would be free territory. Anything below the 36-30 line, slavery could be established. And so this is the precedence that is going to be established going forward as states apply for statehood, or as territories apply for statehood and they're admitted into the Union. If they're above the 36-30 line, it's guaranteed that they will enter as a free territory or a free state. If it's below the line, they can enter as a slave state. Well, this lasts for quite some time in terms of Congress. Everyone's, kind of peaceful in regards to the idea of expansion. But then after the war with Mexico and, we've annexed Texas and we've gotten all of this territory from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the issue of slavery comes up again, particularly for California. So in 1849, okay, is when we have the California gold rush. So gold is discovered and everyone rushes to California to get rich quick. Well, they quickly get the numbers that they need to apply for statehood. So in 1849, California applies for statehood and they want to outlaw the institution of slavery. Well, California, if you think about the line of the 36-30, goes all the way across. It goes through California. So this makes Congress have to address the situation again because the 36-30 line just isn't going to work anymore. We now have more territory. So once again, here comes Henry Clay, okay, our champion of compromise, and he comes in to establish the Compromise of 1850. So he says, look, all right, under this compromise, California will enter as a free state, okay? The South, in exchange, will receive a stricter fugitive slave law, which essentially will allow slave catchers to go into free territory to apprehend runaway slaves. New Mexico and Utah territories, so those are the teal colors there on the map, would receive popular sovereignty. Okay, so popular sovereignty is the right of its residents to vote for or against becoming a slave state. At first, the compromise is rejected. No one liked the terms. The North hated the fugitive slave law, and the South said, this is not fair for California to tip the balance in terms of free states. However, Stephen Douglas, and with the death of President Taylor, they're able to work the compromise through Congress and get it into action. And so these will be the terms. California will enter as free. The South does get a stricter fugitive slave law, and New Mexico and Utah are going to be up for popular sovereignty. So again, thinking about the role of popular sovereignty, it seems very democratic to allow the citizens in the territory to vote whether or not they want to be a slave territory or if they want to be a free territory. This is also primarily applied to the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Many farmers who had moved out west tried to grow cash crops. They tried to grow cotton out west. It's not successful. They're going to have to find other crops and resources to be able to grow, particularly wheat. And so many politicians felt if you're not growing cash crops like cotton, the demand for slave labor in the West is not going to be there. It's going to be too expensive. They will be able to find other laborers for a wheat farm. And so they were convinced that the institution of slavery would no longer exist in the open prairie. It just wasn't going to be profitable. So Stephen Douglas liked the idea of popular sovereignty because it seemed very democratic, and it was, and they felt that the institution of slavery would die out on its own. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is created in 1854. It gets rid of the 3630 line. We're not even trying to uphold that 3630 line anymore. They're going to leave it to the idea of popular sovereignty. They're going to divide the territory into two parts, and they're going to allow the citizens in the territory to determine whether or not they will be a free territory or a slave territory. He felt that this was the most democratic, leave it to the people to decide. Well, the people certainly did respond. And what we see is the beginnings of what is known as Bleeding Kansas, which is where citizens raced into the territories. So there were citizens who raced from Missouri. There were individuals who came from, other free territories. So those from, slave state of Missouri and from free territory, and they end up physically fighting each other, killing one another over this issue. Kansas is split. There is Topeka, Kansas, and there's Lecompton, Kansas, where there's essentially two capitals. One wants it to be a slave state, one wants it to be a free state. And so this should have been a little bit of foreshadowing for the Civil War that will be coming up in 6 years' time. The fact that popular sovereignty and democracy, leaving it to the people, only led to bloodshed. So this is where we're going to stop for right now. And this week we are going to be focusing on the role of expansion and diving into these a little bit further with the trails, as well as diving a bit further into those compromises and understanding how the institution of slavery created so much turmoil in terms of politics when it came to expansion.